The morning fog rolled low over the Lincolnshire fields, thick as smoke, swallowing sound and shape alike. The runway lights were little more than blurred halos in the mist. Somewhere above, an Anson circled, too high, too fast, its engines straining in panic. On the ground, mechanics froze as the aircraft dropped suddenly through the fog. The wheels struck the grass verge, bounced violently, and tore a wing against the frozen earth. Flames did not follow, but the silence that did was almost worse. 2 men climbed out, shaken but alive. The aircraft, another wreck. Scenes like this were happening across Britain. Not in combat, not over occupied Europe, but here at home. In the first 2 years of war, nearly as many RAF airmen died in accidents as in battle. Landing, it seemed, was a more reliable killer than the Luftwaffe. Amid the wreckage and resignation, one pilot refused to accept it. He had an idea, dismissed by his superiors as reckless, even mad. Yet that idea would soon change the way every RAF pilot landed an aircraft, and cut the crash rate by more than 80%. By the spring of 1941, Britain's air war was fought on 2 fronts, one visible, the other hidden. The first was in the skies over Europe, where squadrons of Spitfires, Hurricanes, and Blenheims met the Luftwaffe in daily combat. The second was here at home, on the training fields and maintenance airstrips scattered from Cornwall to Scotland, where the battle was against inexperience, exhaustion, and physics itself. Britain's rapid wartime expansion of the Royal Air Force had come at immense cost. At the outbreak of war, the RAF possessed barely enough trained pilots to fill its frontline squadrons. By 1940, after the Battle of Britain, hundreds more were needed each month. The Empire Air Training Scheme, stretching from Canada to Rhodesia, churned out new flyers at a furious pace. But most arrived in Britain with less than 100 flying hours, often trained under perfect weather and vast open skies. What awaited them in England was altogether different. Short runways, fierce crosswinds, fog that clung to the ground for days, and aircraft heavier, faster, and more temperamental than anything they had flown before. The Air Ministry's records, later examined at Kew, tell the story with bureaucratic precision. Between 1939 and 1941, 3,024 aircraft written off due to landing accidents within the British Isles. No enemy in sight, no anti-aircraft fire, just men and machines meeting the limits of skill and design. The problem lay partly in the aircraft themselves. Wartime designs, from the twin-engined Wellington to the mighty Lancaster prototype, were optimized for payload and range, not for ease of landing. Their wing loadings were high, their undercarriages narrow, and their visibility on approach severely limited. Pilots approaching at night often had only a few dim flare path lamps for guidance. In bad weather, even these could vanish in the mist. Training offered little help. The RAF's manuals of 1939 to 40 prescribed a steep, power-off descent, the so-called glide approach. Pilots were instructed to throttle back, drop full flaps, and glide the aircraft down, cutting power just before touchdown. It was efficient in daylight on a calm day, but in crosswinds or poor visibility, it left no margin for correction. Too fast and the aircraft would bounce, too slow and it would stall, dropping like a stone. Senior instructors warned repeatedly of the danger, yet doctrine was slow to change. In a service defined by discipline and hierarchy, deviation was discouraged. A pilot was expected to follow procedure, not invent his own. Accidents were often blamed on pilot error, a convenient phrase that hid deeper systemic flaws. Among the test pilots at Farnborough and Boscombe Down, concern was mounting. Their reports, circulated quietly through the Air Ministry's Research and Development Division, noted the same pattern. Good pilots were dying in good aircraft, for preventable reasons. At Farnborough, Flight Lieutenant Henry Walmsley, a young engineer turned test pilot, began keeping his own notes. He charted every approach angle, every control movement, every stall warning he could observe. What he found disturbed him. Most crashes occurred not in the final seconds of flight, but in the indecision that preceded them, the moment a pilot, uncertain of his height or speed, cut power too early. "We are teaching men to fall, not to fly," he wrote in one of his log entries now preserved in the Royal Aeronautical Society archives. The phrase spread quietly among the pilots who respected him. Fly the landing, don't fall into it. It would become the foundation of his so-called mad idea, the principle that would eventually transform RAF landing procedures. But in 1941, such thinking bordered on insubordination. To challenge the official manuals was to question the very hierarchy that sustained wartime aviation. Walmsley's notes circulated in whispers. His experiments were done after hours, often on battered training aircraft that nobody would miss. Still, word was spreading, and results were beginning to show. Through 1941 and into early 1942, Britain's airfields became laboratories of necessity. The war's pace demanded aircraft in the air, not on the repair line, yet every month more were lost to landing errors than to enemy action. At Farnborough, the Royal Aircraft Establishment, the nerve center of British aeronautical research, was under pressure to find answers. Its runways were littered with the remains of training mishaps, and its engineers were painfully aware that each crash meant another crew lost, another machine diverted from combat. Here, among a tight-knit community of pilots and engineers, Flight Lieutenant Henry Walmsley began to test his unorthodox theory. His proposal was deceptively simple. Do not glide the landing, fly it. Maintain partial power throughout the descent. Keep control surfaces live and allow the aircraft to fly onto the runway under positive control, instead of dropping it at idle. It was in aerodynamic terms a controlled energy landing, but to many senior officers it sounded dangerously unconventional. Engines fail, they argued. Power on approach is a luxury, not a principle. Walmsley disagreed. He demonstrated over and over that an aircraft with power could recover from misjudged angles and gusting winds. Without power, the pilot was a passenger. His experiments, carried out on both single-engined trainers and twin-engined Wellingtons, were carefully logged. At Boscombe Down, observers noted smoother touchdowns and fewer ground loops. Tire wear decreased. Structural stress on undercarriage assemblies, a chronic maintenance concern, was halved. Most telling of all, the rate of undershoot crashes, where pilots fell short of the runway, plummeted. At first, his reports were filed quietly into the RAE's archives under experimental approach technique. But younger pilots began to take notice. They spoke of Walmsley's way, a technique that required nerve, finesse, and a refusal to let go of control until the aircraft had fully settled. The timing of his work coincided with a crucial shift in RAF operations. By late 1941, night flying had become the norm for Bomber Command. Crews returned to base in darkness, often in poor weather, guided only by dim flare paths or makeshift searchlights. The old method, gliding in silence and trusting the black outline of the ground rear, was proving deadly. The RAF's own statistics, later published in the Air Ministry Flight Safety Review, recorded more than 400 major night landing accidents in a single 12-month period. It was in this environment that Walmsley's method began to attract serious attention. At Cranwell and Duxford, instructors quietly incorporated his powered approach into training sessions. Early results were astonishing. Landing accidents dropped dramatically among squadrons that used it. Within weeks, instructors were rewriting their notes. Still, official endorsement lagged behind. The Air Ministry's training syllabus remained conservative, resistant to field innovation. Yet pressure was mounting from below. Group captains and station commanders were submitting informal memos to Whitehall noting marked improvements in accident rates under modified descent procedures. Behind the scenes, Farnborough's technical division began cross-testing Walmsley's approach. Aerodynamicists confirmed the physics. Maintaining low-level thrust increased control responsiveness, especially in turbulent or low-visibility conditions. The technique reduced the probability of stall at critical altitude, the very moment most training crashes occurred. By 1942, with losses mounting on every front, pragmatism began to outweigh tradition. The Air Ministry's Directorate of Flying Training convened a small committee to review new methods. In its minutes, AIR 16132 at the National Archives, appears a single, understated note: the Farnborough approach technique merits controlled trial across training. Command. That controlled trial would prove historic. The transformation that followed, from whispered experiment to institutional change, reflected something quintessentially British, the triumph of reasoned persistence over rigid doctrine. It was not a revolution, but a quiet correction, one man's insistence that skill and observation could prevail over procedure. Soon, the technique spread beyond training command. Bomber squadrons adopted it on operational airfields. Coastal pilots used it in the dim, misty light of morning returns. And within a year, the phrase "power on landing" entered RAF vernacular. Yet the change came at a cost. Walmsley's work had been done without authorization, sometimes in direct contravention of orders. His methods drew reprimands as well as praise. But his conviction that lives could be saved if pilots were taught to fly the landing never wavered. In the months that followed, the numbers would vindicate him. For every Spitfire that soared into combat glory, there were dozens of training aircraft that never left Britain's shores. They crashed in hedgerows and farmers' fields or burned quietly at the end of a misty runway. The war's official histories would later quantify it in sterile terms, non-operational losses. But to those who lived it, the toll was raw and immediate. At RAF Lossiemouth, instructors spoke of the silence that follows the thud. Pilots often perished not in the air battles over France, but within sight of their own barracks. Between 1940 and 1942, more than 8,000 RAF personnel were killed in flying accidents, most during takeoff and landing. The causes were as varied as the weather. Engines misfired, tires burst, flaps jammed. But the most common tragedy was simple misjudgment. Pilots descending too fast or too slow, uncertain of their height in darkness or fog. Many were barely out of flight school. When Flight Lieutenant Walmsley began speaking quietly of his power on landing idea, he wasn't defying authority for the sake of ego. He was responding to the nightly funerals, the empty mess tables, the charred airframes towed off runways before dawn. For those who understood the stakes, his defiance was not madness. It was mercy. Aircraft in wartime Britain were built to fight, not to forgive. The Wellington, beloved for its durability, was notoriously difficult to land on short runways. The Halifax, with its high wing loading and long nose, offered poor visibility during approach. Even the Lancaster, elegant in flight, could buck violently if flared too late. Design priorities were unambiguous: payload, range, and climb rate. Landing characteristics were secondary. In combat, that made sense. At home, it was lethal. Walmsley's approach from an engineering standpoint addressed what designers could not. By maintaining power through the descent, pilots could keep airflow over the wings and control surfaces, preserving lift and responsiveness. The aircraft remained alive until the moment its wheels touched the ground. At Farnborough, this insight drew the attention of the Royal Aircraft Establishment's aerodynamics section. Engineers noted that the powered descent produced smoother touchdown loads, less stress on landing gear, fewer structural failures. Maintenance crews began to notice the difference. Undercarriage replacements dropped. Brake linings lasted longer. To the mechanical mind, it was proof that good flying technique could achieve what no redesign could. A wartime machine, pushed to its limits, had found new grace through a single human adjustment, a lesson as elegant as it was unrecorded. The RAF of the early 1940s was a force defined by discipline. Procedure governed everything, from the angle of approach to the number of turns in a screw thread. Such precision built reliability, but it also built rigidity. To deviate from an approved technique, even in the name of safety, was to invite scrutiny or punishment. Flight instructors were expected to teach by the book. Those who experimented risked their careers. The Air Ministry's manuals were gospel. The wartime chain of command, absolute. Walmsley's idea therefore struck at the heart of the institution. His peers respected his flying but feared his methods. He was said to approach runways with throttle open and heart steady, an image that alarmed senior officers. Reckless, one squadron leader wrote in a confidential note, and likely to instill undisciplined habits in juniors. Yet beneath the veneer of order, the RAF was already full of quiet subversion. Pilots shared tips, instructors modified lessons, engineers tinkered with equipment long after curfew. The system's rigidity paradoxically bred innovation. Walmsley's defiance wasn't rebellion. It was a continuation of Britain's deeper wartime habit, solving problems quietly, unofficially, through reason and craftsmanship rather than decree. By the time officialdom took notice, his method had already saved hundreds of lives. The RAF would not formally credit him, not for decades, but in the mess halls and hangars, His madness became the standard. The change began not in command briefings or Air Ministry memoranda, but in the quiet confidence of one man who refused to land the way he was told. And in doing so, he forced the RAF to reconsider not only how it flew, but how it thought. In the early 1940s, aviation science was racing ahead, but its findings often lagged behind the instincts of the pilots who lived by them. Walmsley's power-on-landing method, though derided as intuition, would later be supported by post-war aerodynamic theory. The principle was simple, almost elegant. An aircraft descending under power keeps its propeller wash flowing across the wings and tailplane, maintaining control authority even at low airspeeds. Lift is preserved, drag becomes manageable, and the pilot retains the ability to correct a misjudged flare with a touch of throttle rather than a desperate pull of the yoke. In contrast, a power-off glide, the standard method taught since the Great War, left the aircraft aerodynamically dead. Once the flare began, control faded fast. Stall came suddenly. Many a pilot, seeing the runway rush up too quickly, overcompensated, pulling back too hard, ballooning into the air, then slamming down hard on the second descent. Walmsley had observed this cycle too many times to ignore it. His experiments were not guesswork but methodical trials, conducted in calm and crosswind alike. He recorded approach angles, throttle settings, and touchdown distances. By war's end, his notes, archived quietly at the RAF Flying College, would be recognized as the foundation for what post-war manuals would call stabilized powered approach. His mad idea had become doctrine. 1943, RAF Binbrook, Lincolnshire. The night was black as ink, moonless, windless, and cold enough that frost glimmered on the edges of the dispersal tracks. The roar of 4 Merlin engines shattered the stillness as a Lancaster bomber, its belly heavy with ordnance, began its takeoff roll. Inside the aircraft, every man aboard understood the peril. Not from the flak that would meet them over Berlin, but from the landing that awaited them on return. With full fuel and full load, the Lancaster was a brute to control. Landing at night, often on half-illuminated runways or in drifting fog, was a feat of nerve as much as skill. For months, RAF squadrons had been losing bombers on home soil. Engines cut too soon, the glide too steep, the undercarriage collapsing on frozen turf. Bomber Command's records were discreet about the figures, but the air crews knew the truth. Landing mishaps could erase entire crews before they had even seen combat. That April, Wing Commander Harold Bill Walmsley, now an instructor at Binbrook, had been invited to demonstrate his controversial landing technique to a group of visiting senior officers. His method had already spread by reputation, but official sanction remained uncertain. The test would take place under the most unforgiving conditions imaginable: full bomb load, nighttime visibility, and a live crew. The flight departed at 22:15. Walmsley sat in the right-hand seat, observing the pilot, a young flying officer named Andrews. The sortie simulated a bombing run over northern France, then a return to base with minimal navigation aids. At 03 Taurang, the Lancaster reappeared, a dark silhouette against faint starlight. The tower cleared them for landing. Across the airfield, observers and mechanics watched as the aircraft approached, its engines still idling above half throttle. The senior officers murmured uneasily. Landing with power applied went against everything they had been taught. "He'll overshoot," one muttered. Or worse, stall her trying to settle. But Walmsley said nothing. His eyes never left the altimeter. At 200 feet, Andrews trimmed the nose slightly up and kept the throttles open. The propeller wash rippled through the wings, stabilizing the descent. At 100 feet, the aircraft was perfectly aligned. At 50, still under full control, the touchdown, when it came, was almost imperceptible. A gentle hiss of tires, a low shudder through the fuselage. The Lancaster rolled true, slowed steadily, and came to rest at the far end of the runway. No bounce. No skid, no damage. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then a ground mechanic, veteran of too many retrievals, simply nodded. "That's the way it ought to be done," he said. By dawn, word had spread through the station. The senior officers, grudgingly impressed, requested a repeat demonstration. The results were the same: smooth, stable, repeatable. Within a fortnight, RAF Training Command had issued a quiet memorandum, not an order, but a recommendation, endorsing powered descent under controlled throttle. It was the closest Walmsley would ever come to official vindication. From that night, the method was adopted across Bomber Command's operational training units. By mid-1944, nearly every heavy bomber returning from Germany would descend under power, engines alive, lift sustained and control unbroken. Walmsley's technique, once deemed mad, had become standard practice. But its true impact was only understood months later, during the height of the Berlin campaign, when every aircraft and every life counted. By that summer, Bomber Command's crews faced the deadliest missions of the war. Attrition was relentless. Yet at home, landing fatalities had dropped to their lowest since 1939. Statisticians at the Air Ministry noted the figures, but made little comment. It was not policy that had saved them. It was practice. And behind that practice stood one man's quiet conviction that risk could be mastered, not merely endured. The night at Binbrook marked a turning point, not just for one pilot or one station, but for the RAF's entire approach to flying itself. It proved that courage was not always about attack. Sometimes it was about landing safely after the mission was done. Innovation in wartime Britain rarely traveled in straight lines. It spread through whispers, through informal mentorships and unrecorded lessons between sorties. At RAF Swinderby, pilots began to notice that those trained by Walmsley's circle were landing with uncanny smoothness. The difference was not dramatic. No new equipment, no change in cockpit layout, just confidence, precision, and far fewer accidents. Instructors who had once sneered at engine-assisted landings began adopting it discreetly. Just a touch of throttle, they would tell their trainees, keep her alive all the way down. No orders were issued. No reports were filed. But across Lincolnshire, Yorkshire, and Norfolk, the technique spread faster than any formal directive could achieve. By 1943, RAF Training Command quietly recorded a startling trend. Landing accidents had fallen by more than 80% compared to 1940 levels. The Air Ministry, characteristically cautious, attributed the change to improved instruction and pilot discipline, but those who flew knew otherwise. The credit belonged to a small chain of practical men, pilots, engineers, and mechanics, who valued results over recognition. In their hands, innovation was not declared, it was demonstrated. Walmsley's story is not unique in its ingenuity, but in its quiet defiance of wartime culture. Britain in 1941 was a nation of rules held together by improvisation. From the radar stations of the chain home network to the improvised fuel mixes of bomber mechanics, progress often came from individuals willing to test the edges of authority. The RAF, though steeped in hierarchy, survived by adaptation. The same institution that once punished deviations from procedure would later celebrate airmanship, the very judgment Walmsley had exercised. There is a moral weight to that transition. His idea did not simply save aircraft. It redefined the RAF's relationship with knowledge itself. It proved that courage in wartime was not confined to the battlefield. It also lived in the act of questioning, of improving, of refusing to accept needless loss as the cost of war. When historians later traced the origins of modern landing procedures, Walmsley's name appeared rarely, if at all, but his influence endured in every aircraft that descended with power on, steady and alive, through cloud and darkness. His contribution was not written in medals or citations, but in the quiet survival of thousands who lived to fly another day. By the spring of 1943, the RAF had become a markedly safer force to fly for. Yet the skies above Britain were growing more perilous than ever. Bombers now flew deeper into Germany, heavier and faster than before. And once again, the limits of endurance and engineering would be tested, this time not in training fields but over Berlin itself. April 1943. RAF Binbrook, Lincolnshire. The night was black as ink, moonless, windless, and cold enough that frost glimmered on the edges of the dispersal tracks. The roar of 4 Merlin engines shattered the stillness as a Lancaster bomber, its belly heavy with ordnance, began its takeoff roll. Inside the aircraft, every man aboard understood the peril. Not from the flak that would meet them over Berlin, but from the landing that awaited them on return. With full fuel and full load, The Lancaster was a brute to control. Landing at night, often on half-illuminated runways or in drifting fog, was a feat of nerve as much as skill. For months, RAF squadrons had been losing bombers on home soil. Engines cut too soon, the glide too steep, the undercarriage collapsing on frozen turf. Bomber Command's records were discreet about the figures, but the air crews knew the truth. Landing mishaps could erase entire crews before they had even seen combat. That April, Wing Commander Harold Bill Walmsley, now an instructor at Binbrook, had been invited to demonstrate his controversial landing technique to a group of visiting senior officers. His method had already spread by reputation, but official sanction remained uncertain. The test would take place under the most unforgiving conditions imaginable: full bomb load, nighttime visibility, and a live crew. The flight departed at 22:15. Walmsley sat in the right-hand seat observing the pilot, a young flying officer named Andrews. The sortie simulated a bombing run over northern France, then a return to base with minimal navigation aids. At 03 Malfar, the Lancaster reappeared, a dark silhouette against faint starlight. The tower cleared them for landing. Across the airfield, observers and mechanics watched as the aircraft approached, its engines still idling above half throttle. The senior officers murmured uneasily. Landing with power applied went against everything they had been taught. "He'll overshoot," one muttered. Or worse, Stoller trying to settle, but Walmsley said nothing. His eyes never left the altimeter. At 200 feet, Andrews trimmed the nose slightly up and kept the throttles open. The propeller wash rippled through the wings, stabilizing the descent. At 100 feet, the aircraft was perfectly aligned. At 50, still under full control. The touchdown, when it came, was almost imperceptible. A gentle hiss of tires, a low shudder through the fuselage. The Lancaster rolled true, slowed steadily, and came to rest at the far end of the runway. No bounce. No skid, no damage. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then a ground mechanic, veteran of too many retrievals, simply nodded. "That's the way it ought to be done," he said. By dawn, word had spread through the station. The senior officers, grudgingly impressed, requested a repeat demonstration. The results were the same: smooth, stable, repeatable. Within a fortnight, RAF Training Command had issued a quiet memorandum, not an order, but a recommendation, endorsing powered descent under controlled throttle. It was the closest Walmsley would ever come to official vindication. From that night, the method was adopted across Bomber Command's operational training units. By mid-1944, nearly every heavy bomber returning from Germany would descend under power, engines alive, lift sustained and control unbroken. Walmsley's technique, once deemed mad, had become standard practice. But its true impact was only understood months later, during the height of the Berlin campaign, when every aircraft and every life counted. By that summer, Bomber Command's crews faced the deadliest missions of the war. Attrition was relentless. Yet at home, landing fatalities had dropped to their lowest since 1939. Statisticians at the Air Ministry noted the figures but made little comment. It was not policy that had saved them. It was practice. And behind that practice stood one man's quiet conviction that risk could be mastered, not merely endured. The night at Binbrook marked a turning point, not just for one pilot or one station, but for the RAF's entire approach to flying itself. It proved that courage was not always about attack. Sometimes it was about landing safely after the mission was done. Through the summer of 1943, the night skies over Britain and Europe burned without pause. Lancasters, Halifaxes, and Stirlings roared eastward from 100 airfields, from Lincolnshire, Yorkshire, and the flat, endless fields of East Anglia. Berlin, Hamburg, Cologne, the Ruhr, names that by now were carved into the airman's memory as destinations of almost certain peril. Yet for every aircraft that left those runways, another had to find its way back, sometimes crippled, sometimes on one engine, sometimes trailing smoke and flame. For these men, survival depended on more than courage. It depended on control. In the early hours, returning bombers would appear out of the dark in uneven formation, some limping home with holes in their wings, some flown by crews too exhausted to think clearly. Airfields worked under blackout. Floodlights were forbidden. Navigation lights, dangerous. The landing path was often little more than a line of oil lamps and a flare path flickering through mist and drizzle. It was under these conditions that Walmsley's powered landing proved its worth most. Profoundly, a crippled aircraft with one engine running at partial power could no longer glide safely. The old dead stick technique would guarantee a stall before the runway, but maintaining controlled thrust gave pilots the lift and stability they needed to reach home, to keep their aircraft alive just long enough to settle. Squadron records from RAF Waddington and Elsham Wolds, now preserved in the National Archives, show that by late 1943, incidents of landing crashes among returning bombers had fallen dramatically. What had once been a grim routine, wrecks scattered at runway edges, engines embedded in the mud, became an increasingly rare sight. For many aircrews, this change went unexamined. They were too busy surviving to question why. But instructors and ground crews understood the shift. They knew the difference between an aircraft that fell onto the ground and one that arrived. A flight engineer named John Ellis later recalled to the Imperial War Museum, "It was the first time we trusted the throttle right to the ground. The old hand said it was suicide, but it worked. Smoother, safer, somehow calmer. You could feel her settle, not drop. It was like she wanted to come home." That calm mattered more than statistics. In a war measured in chaos, it offered a rare sense of control. By the time Bomber Command reached its operational peak in late 1944, every new pilot was trained in powered approach techniques. The manuals no longer questioned it. The instructors no longer hesitated. Even American crews flying from British bases began adopting the method. But for Walmsley, there was no celebration. His work remained unofficial, his name absent from any communiques or honors lists. He continued to serve quietly, training new pilots, refining his methods, and recording accident data by hand. In his logbook, the entries were terse, methodical, and deeply human. Pilot safe, undercarriage intact, throttle maintained to touch, no bounce. Those few words spoke of countless lives saved. The significance of his idea reached beyond flight mechanics. It marked a cultural shift within the RAF itself. The service had begun the war bound by rigid doctrine. By its end, it was guided by a new principle, the courage to think, test, and adapt. Churchill once said that Britain's secret weapon was the spirit of the small man who thinks for himself. In Walmsley's modest hangar at Binbrook, that spirit found form in metal, oil, and air. By late 1944, the powered approach was no longer seen as madness. It was simply flying as it should be done. And in that acceptance lay the quiet triumph of British innovation, born not in laboratories or design offices, but in the mind of a man who refused to let habit cost another life. The climax of this story is not marked by explosions or enemy fire, but by the steady hum of engines brought safely to rest, each landing a small victory, each saved aircraft, a testament to reason over tradition. As the war entered its final years, those small victories accumulated into something larger and a culture of practical ingenuity that would define British aviation long after peace returned. And when the silence of victory finally came in 1945, it was filled not with cheers, but with the sound of aircraft engines idling, alive, controlled, and home again. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. For the Royal Air Force, the silence that followed was almost disorienting. The roar of engines, the rhythmic night departures, the sound of merlins echoing across the fields, all faded into stillness. Airfields that had once glowed red and orange under flare paths now lay quiet, their concrete runways lined with weeds and discarded fuel drums. Yet behind that calm was an unspoken reckoning. Of the more than 55,000 airmen lost from Bomber Command, nearly a quarter had died not from enemy action, but from accidents, takeoffs, landings, mechanical failures, and training mishaps. Every improvement, every technique that had reduced those losses carried its own quiet weight of lives preserved. When post-war accident reports were compiled by the Air Ministry's Directorate of Flight Safety, one pattern stood out. In the final 2 years of the conflict, landing and approach crashes had dropped by over 80% compared to the early years of the war. No single official order explained it. But among instructors and engineers there was no mystery. They knew what had changed. At RAF Binbrook, where Walmsley had conducted his first public demonstration of the powered approach, the training logs were still kept meticulously. Entries from late 1944 show entire courses completed without a single landing incident, a statistic unthinkable in 1940. Commanders noted the difference in tone among new recruits: calm, deliberate, disciplined, yet confident. Pilots no longer treated descent as a gamble, but as a controlled maneuver. After demobilization, Walmsley returned quietly to civilian aviation. He never sought attention, nor did he publish his findings. But the method he pioneered lived on, embedded in the RAF's post-war flight manuals, adopted by civilian flight schools and echoed in every pilot's instinct to fly her on, never let her drop. In 1946, when the newly formed Royal Air Force College at Cranwell revised its training syllabus, the powered approach was included as standard. No mention was made of its controversial origins. It was simply part of how flying was done, as though it had always been that way. For many instructors, that was the measure of true success, when an innovation becomes so natural, so obvious, that no one remembers a time before it existed. In the broader landscape of post-war Britain, Walmsley's story mirrored a national theme. The country emerged from war battered but inventive, a society rebuilt on lessons learned through necessity. The same spirit that had driven radar, code breaking, and jet propulsion also drove small practical revolutions in everyday practice. Each one in its way carried the same moral: that progress is the reward of those who dare to question routine. At the Imperial War Museum in London, among the artifacts of Bomber Command, there stands a single control column, bent but unbroken, salvaged from a Lancaster that landed safely on 2 engines in March 1944. The accompanying note, written decades later, reads simply, "Pilot reported landing under power. All crew survived." It is perhaps the most fitting epitaph for Walmsley's legacy, a legacy of survival, precision, and quiet rebellion. By 1947, British aviation was entering a new era. Jet aircraft, swept wings, and pressurized cabins were transforming flight. But even in this new world, one principle remained unchanged: the powered approach. Its logic, that control should never be abandoned, became fundamental to aviation safety worldwide. Walmsley himself faded from the records, his wartime service tucked away in training archives and RAF bulletins. But his idea, dismissed once as madness, had quietly rewritten the book of flight. In the years that followed, the RAF underwent rapid transformation. War-weary Lancasters were retired. Mosquitoes and Halifaxes were scrapped or sold. Airfields that had once pulsed with urgency became silent memorials of a generation that had learned to fly through fear and ingenuity. But within those changes, the influence of Walmsley's principle endured, invisible yet foundational. Every new pilot, whether on piston aircraft or the emerging Meteor jets, was taught that landing was not a passive act. It demanded power, control, and calm. Flight instructors now spoke of energy management, of maintaining thrust and lift together, terms that would become standard decades later. Though the technology evolved, the philosophy remained rooted in those wartime airfields of Lincolnshire and Norfolk, where men like Walmsley had refused to accept unnecessary loss. Civil aviation, too, absorbed the lesson. BOAC and BEA, Britain's post-war carriers, incorporated powered descent into their procedures for propeller-driven aircraft. By the 1950s, even American manuals acknowledged the British contribution, noting that approach under power offered superior safety margins and poor visibility, particularly on wet or short runways. In a quiet sense, Walmsley's defiance had changed global aviation. Yet, as with many wartime innovations, recognition was slow. The Air Ministry rarely credited individuals for procedural change, especially when it originated outside official research channels. To admit that one man's unauthorized experiment had redefined flight safety was perhaps administratively inconvenient. Walmsley never complained. He had achieved what he wanted, not fame but fewer funerals. His peers remembered him not for speeches or citations, but for a sentence he was fond of repeating: "An aircraft's alive while the engine's alive. Keep her living and she'll bring you home." When he died in 1968, few beyond the small circle of RAF instructors knew his name. Yet every time a pilot eased a throttle forward on final approach, unknowingly invoking his principle, his legacy stirred in the engine's hum. By the 1970s, as Britain's wartime generation aged, aviation historians began to piece together the forgotten human stories behind technical progress. Among the dusty logbooks and training manuals preserved at Kew and Cranwell, they found the first references to Walmsley's method. Marginal notes. Instructor comments. Brief, practical reminders written in the margins of procedure sheets. Nothing grand, but enough to trace the lineage of an idea that had saved countless lives. In 1984, a small article in Flight International revisited the subject of wartime landing techniques. It mentioned, almost in passing, an RAF instructor who insisted on throttle-applied descent, noting the dramatic reduction in crashes attributed to the practice. No photograph accompanied the piece. No first name was given, but those who knew, knew. At Cranwell today, young pilots still learn the fundamentals of powered descent. Modern simulators replicate the same physics that Walmsley discovered through trial and nerve. Lift preserved by airflow, control maintained through thrust. The principle has not changed in 80 years. Only the noise has. When the instructor's voice echoes across the headset, keep a touch of power on. Don't let her sink. It carries, however faintly, the echo of one man's defiance against the accepted limits of his time. That is the true measure of endurance. Not the preservation of fame, but the persistence of wisdom. The war had taken Britain to the edge of its endurance, yet it also revealed its character, calm, inventive, and quietly determined. From radar towers to flight decks, from Bletchley's machines to Walmsley's runway, the same truth endured. Courage was not loud, and progress was never accidental. The engine's hum fades. The aircraft settles, and in that still moment before the wheels meet the earth, the legacy of one mad idea continues, bringing Britain's pilots home, safely, generation after generation. In the long, reflective quiet after war, Britain often remembers her great inventions, radar, the Spitfire, the bouncing bomb. But the truest measure of ingenuity lies not only in machines, but in the minds of those who dared to make them better. Harold Walmsley was not a designer, nor a commander. He was a pilot instructor, one of thousands, working through cold nights and endless sorties. Yet from his quiet insistence came a change that rippled through generations of flight. He embodied the best of Britain's wartime spirit, patient, methodical, quietly courageous. His contribution did not roar like the engines of a bomber, nor command headlines. It lived instead in the steady descent of aircraft that would once have fallen short. It lived in the saved lives of aircrews who, after hours of terror above Europe, landed safely on British soil. In that sense, Walmsley's idea was not merely technical, it was moral. It reminded the RAF, and perhaps the nation, that courage is not the absence of caution, but its perfection. That survival is not chance, but discipline. And that progress begins not with permission, but with conviction. 80 years on, every pilot who lowers a landing gear, steadies the throttles, and feels the aircraft respond beneath their hands, they perform, unknowingly, a ritual shaped by that wartime defiance. The sound of the engines alive until the last moment is more than a mechanical truth. It is an inheritance. From the runways of Lincolnshire to the cockpits of modern airliners, the lesson endures, quiet, invisible, yet utterly British. Keep power alive. Keep control, and never stop improving the way home.